We had to wait there maybe half a minute until it went by, going toward New York. I am not at all sure whether we crossed right there at Commercial Avenue or went a little further down George Street and went diagonally across to the church. Then we stopped there and looked at the church to see whether there were any lights. There were no lights burning. Then Mrs. Hall said we might as well go down and see if it could not be possible that he was at the Mills house. We went down there, down George Street until we came to Carmen Street, turned down Carmen Street, and got in front of the Mills house and stood there 2 or 3 minutes to see if there were any lights in the Mills apartment. There were none. Willie then described, street by street, the return home, and ended with, I opened the front door with my latchkey. If you wish me, I will show it to you. My sister said, you might as well go to bed, you can do no more good. With that, I went upstairs to bed. This was the story that Alexander Simpson had to shake. But before Willie was turned over to him, the witness told how he heard that his brother-in-law had been killed. I remember I was in the parlor, said Willie, reading a copy of the New York Times. I heard someone coming up the steps, and I glanced up, and I heard my aunt, Mrs. Charles J. Carpenter, say, well, you might as well know it. Edward has been shot. Willie's voice was thick with emotion. He was asked what happened then. Well, he said, I simply let the paper go, that way. He let his left hand fall slowly and limply to his side, and I put my head down, and I cried. Mr. Case asked him if he was present at or had anything to do with the murder of Mr. Hall and Mrs. Mills. Absolutely nothing at all, boomed Willie, coming out of his posture of sorrow belligerently erect. The attorney for the defense turned with a confident little bow to Alexander Simpson. The special prosecutor sauntered over and stood in front of the witness. Willie took in his breath sharply. Alexander Simpson, a lawyer, a state senator, slight, perky, capable of harsh tongue lashings, given to sarcasm and innuendo, had intimated that he would tie Willie Stevens into knots. Word had gone around that he intended to flay the eccentric fellow. Hence his manner now came as a surprise. He spoke in a gentle, almost inaudible voice, and his attitude was one of solicitous friendliness. Willie, quite unexpectedly, drew first blood. Simpson asked him if he had ever earned his livelihood. For about 4 or 5 years, said Willie, I was employed by Mr. Siebold, a contractor. Not having anticipated an affirmative reply, Simpson paused. Willie leaned forward and said politely, Do you wish his address? He did this in good faith, but the spectators took it for what the Times called a sally, because Simpson had been in the habit of letting loose a swarm of investigators on anyone whose name was brought into the case. No, thank you, muttered Simpson above a roar of laughter. The prosecutor now set about picking at Willie's story of the night of September 14th. He tried to find out why the witness and his sister had not knocked on the Millses' door to see if Mr. Hall was there. Unfortunately for the steady drumming of questions, Willie soon broke the prosecutor up with another laugh. Simpson had occasion to mention a New Brunswick boarding house called the Bayard, and he pronounced it Bay as it is spelled. With easy politeness, Willie corrected him. Bayard, said Willie. Bayard, repeated Simpson. Willie smiled as at an apt pupil. Simpson bowed slightly. The spectators laughed again. Presently, the witness made a slip, and Simpson pounced on it like a stooping falcon. Asked if he had not at the scene of the murder stood in the light of an automobile while a woman on a mule went by, Willie replied, I never remember that occurrence. Let us take up the court record from there. Question. You would remember if it occurred, wouldn't you? Answer. I certainly would, but I don't remember of ever being in an automobile, and the light from the automobile shone on a woman on a mule. Question. Do you say you were not there, or you don't remember? Answer. I say positively I was not there. Question. Why did you say you don't remember? Answer. Does that not cover the same thing? Question. No, it don't, because you might be there and not remember it. Answer. Well, I will withdraw that, if I may, and say I was not there positively. Willie assumed an air of judicial authority as he withdrew his previous answer, and he spoke his positive denial with sharp decision. Mr. Simpson abruptly tried a new tack. "You have had a great deal of experience in life, Mr. Stevens," he said, "and have read a great deal, they say, and know a lot about human affairs. Don't you think it sounds rather fishy when you say you got up in the middle of the night to go and look for Dr. Hall, and went to the house and never even knocked on the door, with your experience of human affairs and people that you met and all that sort of thing? Don't that seem rather fishy to you?" There was a loud bickering of attorneys before Willie could say anything to this. Finally, Judge Parker turned to the witness and said, "Can you answer that, Mr. Stevens?" "The only way I can answer it, Your Honor," said Willie scornfully, "is that I don't see that it is at all fishy." The prosecutor jumped to something else. "Dr. Hall's church was not your church, was it?" he asked. "He was not a doctor, sir," said Willie, once more the instructor. "He was the Reverend Mr. Hall." Simpson paused, nettled. "I am glad you corrected me on that," he said. The courtroom laughed again. The prosecutor now demanded that Willie repeat his story of what happened at 2:30 a.m. He hoped to establish, he intimated, that the witness had learned it by rote. Willie calmly went over the whole thing again in complete detail, but no one of his sentences was the same as it had been. The prosecutor asked him to tell it a third time. The defense objected vehemently. Simpson vehemently objected to the defense's objection. The court: "We will let him tell it once more." At this point, Willie said, "May I say a word?" "Certainly," said Simpson. "Say all you want." Weighing his words carefully, speaking with slow emphasis, Willie said, "All I have to say is, I was never taught, as you insinuate, by any person whatsoever. That is my best recollection from the time I started out with my sister to this present minute." Simpson did not insist further on a third recital. He wanted to know now how Willie could establish the truth of his statement that he was in his room from 8 or 9 o'clock until his sister knocked on the door at 2:30 a.m. "Why," said Willie, "if a person sees me go upstairs and does not see me come downstairs, isn't that a conclusion that I was in my room?" The court record shows that Mr. Simpson replied, "Absolutely." "Well," said Willie expansively, "that is all there was to it." Nobody but the pig woman had testified to seeing Willie after he went up to his room that night. Barbara Tuff, a servant who had been off during the day, testified she got back to the Hall home about 10 o'clock and noticed that Willie's door was closed. Willie had testified that it wouldn't stay closed until he locked it. Louise Geist of the annulment suit had testified that she had not seen Willie that night after dinner. It was Willie's story against the pig woman's. That day in court he overshadowed her. When he stepped down from the witness chair, his shoulders were back and he was smiling broadly. Headlines in the Times the next day said, "Willie Stevens remains calm under cross-examination. Witness a great surprise." There was a touch of admiration, almost of partisanship, in most of the reporters' stories. The final verdict could be read between the lines. The trial dragged on for another 10 days, but on the 3rd of December, Willie Stevens was a free man. He was glad to get home. He stood on the porch at 23 Nicol Avenue, beaming at the house. Reporters had followed him there. He turned to them and said solemnly, "It is 104 days since I've been here, and I want to get in." They let him go. Mrs. Hall died on December 19, 1942, at the age of 68. Her devoted brother Willie outlived her by only 11 days. They were buried in the same family vault in Greenwood Cemetery, Brooklyn, where Dr. Hall had been buried in 1922. Mr. Mills, still alive and active at last report, not seeming to have aged at all, according to a friend, has been sexton in a Methodist church in New Jersey for many years, and lives quietly with his son. I see no reason to throw a sharper spotlight upon them now. Nobody in New Brunswick has talked about the Hall Mills case in many years, a reporter who covered the trial told me. Other scandals and excitements began spreading like witchgrass soon after the famous Somerville trial of 1926. 5 months later, Lindbergh flew the ocean, and names like Sacco and Vanzetti, Ruth Snyder and Judd Gray, Peaches and Daddy Browning pushed the Hall Mills case out of the papers into the files. Babe Ruth's bat was soon to hit 60 home runs in one season, and the Brown Derby of Al Smith could be seen bobbing about on clear days and cloudy from any part of the country. Little physical trace of the ancient murder and trial is left anywhere. DeRussey's Lane, which Detective David once pointed out to Willie Stevens, is now entirely changed. In the early 30s, it was renamed Franklin Boulevard, and where the Reverend Mr. Edward W. Hall and Mrs. Eleanor Mills lay dead, there is now a row of neat brick and stucco houses. The famous crabapple tree under which the bodies were found disappeared the first weekend after the murders. It was hacked to pieces, roots and all, by souvenir hunters. The Waters of the Moon. I had broken away from an undulant discussion of kinetic dimensionalism and was having a relaxed moment with a slender woman I had not seen before, who described herself as a chaoticist, when my hostess, an avid disturber of natural balances and angles of repose, dragged me off to meet the guest of honor, a Mr. Pfeiffer, editor of a literary review. "Holds his liquor beautifully," my hostess said. "Burns it up, I guess. He's terribly intense." Pfeiffer was pacing back and forth on a rug, haranguing a trapped etcher whose reluctant eyes kept following him as if he were a tennis rally. "No, I'm not interested in the aging American female author," Pfeiffer was saying. "That's a phenomenon that confounds analysis. The female writer's fertility of invention and glibness of style usually survive into senility, just as her artistic gestation frequently seems to be independent of the nourishment of thought." Pfeiffer made 3 turns of the rug in silence. He had the expression of a chemist absorbed in abstruse formulae. "I am interested in the male American writer who peters out in his 50s, who has the occupational span of a hockey player. The tempo of our American life may have something to do with it, but there must be a dozen other factors that dry up the flow of ideas and transform a competent prose style into the meager iterations of a train announcer." My hostess finally broke in, and Pfeiffer stopped pacing to shake hands. The etcher seized the opportunity to disappear. "Mr. Thurber is 52, my hostess said. "He hasn't written anything since last April." Pfeiffer looked at me as if I were the precipitate of a moderately successful test tube experiment. My first name suddenly reminded him of a tangent of his theme. "Take Henry James," he said. "If he had lived in this country, he would probably have spent his middle years raising collies or throwing darts. It is preposterous to assume, however, that region or climate is the important factor. There must be something, though, in the American way of life and habit of thought. I want to get Wiley or Margaret Mead or somebody to do a comprehensive treatise on the subject, looking at it from the viewpoints of marriage, extramarital relations, the educational system, home environment, the failure of religion, the tyranny of money, and the rich breeding ground of decomposition, which I believe is to be found in syphilophobia, prostatitis, early baldness, peptic ulcer, edentulous cases, true and hysterical impotence, and spreading of the metatarsals." I tried to wrench a tray of martinis from a man in a white coat, but he would only let me have one. "Let's go over and sit down on that sofa," Pfeiffer said. I followed him, glancing ruefully over my shoulder at my lost chaoticist. "It's a difficult article," I said. "If you use names, it's dangerous, and if you don't, it won't be interesting. You can't very well say that Joseph Dokes, after petering out on page 73 of his unfinished novel, Whatever Gods, a childlike and feathery permutation of his first book, Fear Set Free, is living in sin with his cook and spends his time cutting the pips out of playing cards." Pfeiffer took my olive. "The article is not to be a gossip column," he said. "It's to be a scholarly treatise. I am interested in exploring the causes of literary collapse, not in collecting scandalous post-disintegration case histories of quixotic individuals who would no doubt have gone to pieces in precisely the same way had they been milliners or pharmacists' mates. Then, unhappily, I said, you cannot follow the old codgers past the hour of their deterioration, and in so doing, you will omit a great deal of fascinating sequelae. You are interested only in causation. You would trace the career of, let us say, Bruce Balliol, up to that afternoon in June when he abruptly began to write the middle section of Love Not the Wind in the manner of the late Senator Albert J. Beveridge, and realized to his dismay that he was washed up at 56. I would take him through his divorce, his elopement with the hairdresser, and those final baffling years on the Peacock Ranch. A grim man I had never seen before walked up to us, dribbling his Manhattan. "Cora in the bells and grass," he said. "Cora with a cherry halfway to her lips." The man walked away. "I like Eve better than Cora," I said. Pfeiffer apparently didn't know the poem the man had paraphrased. "You do," he said, with his laboratory glint. "You were talking," I said. "Go on." Pfeiffer took a curved briar pipe out of his pocket and rubbed the bowl on his pants leg. He began to chew on the stem of his pipe. "That was poor old Greg Selby," I said. "A perfect specimen for your analysis. He stopped writing suddenly a fortnight after his 54th birthday. Bang." Pfeiffer started. "Like that," I said. "His felicity of style was the envy and despair of us all. And then abruptly, one day, he began to write like a doorman, cockeyed on cherry brandy." "I never heard of any writer named Greg Selby," Pfeiffer said. I lifted a martini from a passing tray. "He has never published anything," I said. "He is going to leave all his work to Harvard, to be published 1,000 years from now. Greg's writing has what he calls projected meaning. He feels that in another millennium the intellectuals will understand it readily enough. I have never made head or tail of any of his stuff myself, but there is no missing the unique quality of the most exquisite English prose of our time." Pfeiffer made figure eights in the air with his pipe. "He seems a little special," he said. "I'm not interested in idiosyncratic variables, except perhaps his footnotes." "He is a male American writer who petered out in his middle 50s, I insisted. "He fits in perfectly." "What I have in mind is the published writer of established merit," my companion said as I stopped another martini tray. "But go on. What happened to this man Selby?" "His first wife, Cora," I began, "claimed to have discovered that his last book, Figgerin Gree, was his next to last book, St. Tammany's Reign, written backward. It was insupportable to Greg that his wife should go through his books like a public accountant investigating a bank ledger. He threw her and her Siamese cats out of the house. The macaw wouldn't go. He had not heard the last of her, however. She called him up every few days, and in the falsetto of a little girl, asked him why he didn't dramatize the Little Colonel stories for Margaret O'Brien. She divorced him finally and married a minor league outfielder. "This is really terribly special," Pfeiffer complained, signaling a tray of highballs. "Cora was ordinary enough. It was Eve who was special. She was the author of a number of mystery books. You probably remember Pussy Wants a Coroner?" Pfeiffer replied, a little pettishly, that he did not read mysteries. "After her marriage to Greg," I went on, "Eve's books took on a curiously Gothic tone. The style was cold and blocky, and the plots had all the flexibility of an incantation. She explained to her alarmed publishers that she was trying to write for the understanding of intellectuals 1,000 years ago." Pfeiffer put his drink on the floor and stood up. "I presume you would consider Douglas Bryce a published author of established merit, wouldn't you?" I demanded. I had thought the name up fast. "Well," Pfeiffer said uneasily. He sat down again. "Doug," I said, "ran out of ideas and his command of sentence construction at the same time on a Wednesday. He was 58. That was a long time ago. He died in 1932 on his chinchilla farm, and only the hat-check girl, Dolores, was at his bedside. Nell left him after the Lawrence Stone incident." Pfeiffer recrossed his legs restlessly and reached for another highball. "It would be as hard to find a copy of The Tenant of the Room now as it would be to turn up a first edition of V.V.'s Eyes," I told him. "The Tenant was Doug's last book. It was a flimsy rehash of his earlier A Piece in Bloom. The love story was a little more disgusting, but in general it was a slight rearrangement of the well-worn characters and incidents. Doug had once had a facile and effective style, but the writing in The Tenant fell well within the capabilities of a shrewd pin boy. I took another martini. "Get on with it," Piper said. Nell once told me that after the failure of The Tenant, Doug spent his days making cryptic and vainglorious notes on pieces of Kleenex, door jambs, the fly-leaves of books and shirt fronts. He would jot down such things as translate Lippmann into Latin, reply to Shelburne essays, refute Toynbee, collaborate with GBS, call Gilbert Miller. Other notes indicated that he planned a history of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford in verse, an account of women in sports to be called Atalanta to Babe Diedrichson, and a pageant based on the Tristram legends in which he proposed to star the late Devereux Milburn. "I really must go," Piper said. He stood up and then resumed his seat. "What was the Lawrence Stone incident?" he asked. Just before he bought the chinchilla farm, Nell found, scribbled on the bathroom wall, "The Shore, the Plain, the Mountain, a trilogy by Douglas Bryce." Under that he had written, "A monumental achievement," which he had signed Van Wyck Brooks. But he was on to himself at last. He was tired, and he was through, and he knew it. The reservoir of his natural talent had run dry, and he had been reaching for the waters of the moon. But as I say, he was on to himself. Under it all, he had scrawled almost illegibly, "A trilogy-willogy by Brycey Wicey." Who was this man Stone? And then I must go, Piper said. People are beginning to sing. Doug had one more project, I said. He conceived the idea of writing a long biography of a man picked at random in the street. The book was to be called Let 20 Pass. He stood one day at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 44th Street, counted off 20 men who walked by going north, and accosted the 21st. The 21st was a large, preoccupied mining engineer named Lawrence Stone. He called the police, and a rather nasty fuss was kicked up in the papers. It came out, you remember, that Stone was quite deaf, and his functional disability had twisted Doug's proposal into a shockingly complex plan to seize the major networks. Dolores was passing when Doug accosted Stone, and her testimony as to what was actually said cleared Bryce. It was a near thing, though. Piper twisted around on the sofa, slowly and with difficulty, as if invisible blankets hampered his legs. I saw that his unfriendly stare glittered frostily in almost imperceptibly crossed eyes. I wondered I had not noticed before that his liquor, much of it unburned, had left him, in spite of a fluent grasp on his subject, balanced precariously between command and dissolution. His expression took away all my pride of invention in the garish show of figures I had conjured up to ornament his theme. I had been careless, too, in the name of the mining engineer, and Piper had caught me out. "I happen to be familiar with Browning," he said with shrewd dignity, "and I happen to know how the line that begins 'Let 20 pass' ends." I was conscious of a figure at my shoulder. Someone had come to save me. It was the slender lady, my dark lady of chaos, grown a little mistier with the passing of the afternoon, and possessed now of the posture of the rose in a summer wind. I stood up, and Piper managed it too. "Nell," I said, "may I present Mr. Piper?" He bowed stiffly. "This is Nell Bryce," I told him. The game was up, but here I was, kicking field goals by moonlight. Piper here, I said, would not have followed Bierce beyond the Rio Grande, or Villon through the port of Saint-Denis, to see in what caprice or rondeau their days came to an end. "Let's phone the police and plague 'em till hell won't have it," the lady said. It seemed to hurt Piper like a slap. He bowed almost too low to sustain the moral advantage he undoubtedly held over both of us. "It is a great pity, madam," he said, "that your mythical husband had the misfortune to encounter an engineer named Stone. Ah, what a flaw in the verisimilitude was there. It is a great pity your husband did not have the luck to encounter an engineer named Costello, or McKelway, or Shapiro." The dark lady listened to him with the expression of one who is receiving complicated directions in a great strange town. Pfeiffer turned a cold, uncertain eye on me. "Let 20 pass," he snarled, "and stone the 21st. The dark lady watched him on a quick opening play, break between guard and center of a mixed quartet. "Now how in the God's name," she had a charming diaphragmatic convulsion, "did he know my husband was mythical?" It was too long a story to go into. I took her arm and, in silence, led her to the telephone to call the police. Exhibit X. I had been a code clerk in the State Department in Washington for 4 months during the First World War, before my loyalty was investigated, if you could call my small, pleasant interview with Mr. Chanda an investigation. He had no dossier on Thurber, James Grover, except a birth certificate and draft board deferment papers. In 1918, Americans naively feared the enemy more than they feared one another. There was no FBI to speak of, and I had neither been followed nor secretly photographed. A snooping photographer could have caught me taking a code book home to study one night and bringing it back the next day, an act that was indiscreet and properly regretted when I learned the rules. But a pictorial record of my activities outside the Bureau of Indexes and Archives in Washington would actually have been as innocent as it might have looked damning. It would have shown me in the company of Mrs. Nichols, head of the information desk at the State War and Navy Building, a psychic lady I had known since I was 6, George P. Martin, proprietor of the Post Cafe, and Mrs. Rabbit, his assistant, Frank Farrington, a movie actor who had played the part of a crook named Brain in The $1 Million Mystery, and Jack Bridges, a Los Angeles airmail flyer and Hispano-Suiza expert. I doubt if any such photographs, even one showing me borrowing $20 from Bridges half an hour after meeting him for the first time in my life, would have shaken Mr. Chanda's confidence in me. Mr. Chanda called me to his office about a week before I was to sail for France and the Paris embassy. He was a tall, quiet, courteous gentleman, and he had only one question to ask me. He wanted to know if all my grandparents had been born in the United States. I said yes. He wished me Godspeed, we shook hands, and I left. That's all there was to it. Waking up at night now and looking back on it, I sometimes wonder how I would have come out of one of those 3-men inquisitions the State Department was once caught conducting. Having as great a guilt sense as any congressman, and a greater tendency to confession, it might have taken me hours to dredge up out of my mind and memory all the self-indictments that must have been there. I believed then, and still do, that generals of the Southern Confederacy were, in the main, superior to the generals of the Northern armies. I suspected there were flaws in the American political system. I doubted the virgin birth of United States senators. I thought that German cameras and English bicycles were better than ours, and I denied the existence of actual proof that God was exclusively a citizen of the United States. But as I say, Mr. Chanda merely asked me about my grandparents, and that was all. I realize now that as a measure of patriotism, the long existence of my ancestors on American soil makes me more loyal than Virginia Dare or even George Washington, but I didn't give it any thought at the time. Before I sailed on the SS Orizaba, a passenger ship converted into an army transport and looking rather sheepish about it, I was allowed to spend 4 days in Columbus, Ohio, and my family has preserved, for reasons known only to families, a snapshot taken of me on the last day of my leave. The subject of the photograph is obviously wearing somebody else's suit, which not only convicts him of 3 major faults in a code clerk, absent-mindedness, carelessness, and peccability, but gives him the unwanted appearance of a Saluki, who, through some egregious mischance of nature, has exchanged his own ears for those of a barn owl. If this would not be enough to cause a special agent to phone Hoover personally, regardez, as the French Sûreté would say excitedly, the figure of this alarming indiscret. His worried expression indicates that he has just mislaid a code book, or, what is worse, has sold one. Even Mr. Hoover's dullest agent could tell that the picture is that of a man who would be putty in the hands of a beautiful or even a dowdy female spy. The subject's curious but unmistakable "you ask me and I'll tell you" look shows that he would babble high confidences to low companions on his third panneau d'alleau. This man could even find some way to compromise the Department of Agriculture, let alone the Department of State. The picture would have aroused no alarm in the old days, however, for it was almost impossible to be a security risk in the State Department in 1918, no matter how you looked. All our code books except one were quaint transparencies dating back to the time when Hamilton Fish was Secretary of State under President Grant. And they were intended to save words and cut telegraph costs, not to fool anybody. The new code book had been put together so hastily that the word America was left out, and code groups so closely paralleled true readings that LOVVE, for example, was the symbol for love. Whatever slight illusion of secrecy we code clerks may have had was dispelled one day by a dour gentleman who announced that the Germans had all our codes. It was said that the Germans now and then got messages through to Washington taunting us about our childish ciphers, and suggesting on one occasion that our clumsy device of combining two codes in a desperate effort at deception would have been a little harder if we had used two other codes which they named. This may have been rumor or legend, like the story current at the time that 6 of our code books were missing, and that a 7th, neatly wrapped, firmly tied, and accompanied by a courteous note, had been returned to one or other of our embassies by the Japanese, either because they had finished with it or because they already had one. A system of deception as easy to see through as the passing attack of a grammar school football team naturally produces a cat's-out-of-the-bag attitude. In enciphering messages in one code, in which the symbol for quote was to make up a group Zoxil, we were permitted to use unzoxil for unquote, an aid to perspicuity that gave us code clerks the depressing feeling that our tedious work was merely an exercise in block lettering. The department may have comforted itself with the knowledge that even the most ingenious and complex codes could have been broken down by enemy cipher experts. Unzoxilation just made it a little easier for them. Herbert O. Yardley, one-time chief cryptographer of the War Department, warned the government in a book published nearly 30 years ago that the only impregnable codes are those whose pattern is mechanically jumbled in transmission by a special telegraphic method that reassembles the pattern at the point of reception. To prove his point, Yardley revealed how he had broken the toughest Japanese code 5 years before. The government must have taken his advice. I doubt that we could have got through a Second World War shouting, "Zoxil, here we come, ready or not, unzoxil." The State Department, in the happy-go-lucky tradition of the time, forgot to visa my special diplomatic passport, and this was to cause a tremendous brouhaha later on, when the French discovered I was loose in their country without the signs, seals, and signatures they so devoutly respect. The captain of the Orizaba wanted nothing to do with me when I boarded his ship, whether my passport was visaed or not. He had no intention of taking orders from the State Department or carrying its code clerks, and who the hell was Robert Lansing anyway? He finally let me stay on board after I had bowed and scraped and touched my forelock for an hour, but he refused to have anything at all to do with my trunk. When I received it in Paris more than a year later, everything in it was covered with the melted chocolate of a dozen Hershey bars I had tucked in here and there. I had been instructed to report to Colonel House at the Hotel Crillon when I got to Paris, but I never saw him. I saw instead an outraged gentleman named Auchincloss, who plainly regarded me as an unsuccessfully comic puppet in a crude and inexcusable practical joke. He said bitterly that code clerks had been showing up for days, that Colonel House did not want even one code clerk, let alone 12 or 15, and that I was to go on over to the embassy where I belonged. The explanation was, I think, as simple as it was monumental. Several weeks before, the State Department in Washington had received a cablegram from Colonel House in Paris, urgently requesting the immediate shipment of 12 or 15 code clerks to the Crillon, where headquarters for the American peace delegation had been set up. It is plain to me now what must have happened. Colonel House's cablegram must have urgently requested the immediate shipment of 12 or 15 code books, not code clerks. The cipher groups for books and clerks must have been nearly identical, say Dog-Ek and Dog-Ed, and hence a setup for the telegraphic garble. Thus, if my theory is right, the single letter D sent me to Paris when I had originally been slated for Berne. Even after 40 years, the power of that minuscule slip of the alphabet gives me a high sense of insecurity. A D for a C sent Colonel House clerks instead of books, and sent me to France instead of Switzerland. On the whole, I came off far better, as events proved, than the Colonel did. There I was in Paris with a lot of jolly colleagues, and there was Colonel House up to his ears in code clerks, but without any code books, or at least not enough to handle the flow of cablegrams to and from the Crillon when the peace conference got underway. That tiny D was to involve the State Department, the Paris Embassy, the peace conference, and in a way that would have delighted Gilbert and Sullivan, the United States Navy, in a magnificent comic opera of confusion. An admiral of the Navy, for some reason, probably because he had a lot of Navy code books, arbitrarily took over at the Crillon, the State Department's proud prerogative of diplomatic communication, and a code shambles that might have perplexed Herbert Yardley himself developed when cablegrams in Navy codes were dispatched to the State Department in Washington, which could not figure them out and sent back bewildered and frantic queries in State Department codes, which the Admiral and his aides could not unravel. The Navy has always been proud of its codes, and the fact that they couldn't be broken by the State Department only went to show how strong they were. But when communication between the peace conference and Washington came to a dead stop, the Admiral agreed to a compromise. His clerks, young and eager junior lieutenants, would use the State Department codes. This compounded the confusion, since the lieutenants didn't know how to use the strange codes. The dozen State Department clerks Colonel House had turned away, and now needed badly, were finally sent for after a month, but even then they were forced to work under the supervision of the Navy. The great confusion was at last brought to an end when the desperate State Department finally turned to a newspaper man for help and assigned him to go and get its stolen power of diplomatic communication and bring it back where it belonged. Not since an American battleship, many years before, in firing a 21-gun salute in honor of the President of France, had accidentally used real shells and blown the bejesus out of the harbor of Le Havre, had the Army-Navy so royally loused up a situation. And think of it, a Dog-Ek for a Dog-Ed would have sent me to Berne, where nothing at all ever happened. The last time I saw the old building at 5 Rue de Chaillot that housed the Chancellery of the American Embassy when I was a code clerk was in 1937. Near the high-grilled door, a plaque proclaimed that Myron T. Herrick was our ambassador during the First World War, thus perpetuating a fond American misconception and serving as a monument to the era of the Great Confusion. The truth is, as I have already said in an earlier piece in this book, that from December 1914 until after the war in 1919, an unsung man named William Sharp was our ambassador to France. This note of bronze fuzziness cheered me in a peculiar way. It was a brave, cockeyed testament to the enduring strength of a nation that can get more ingloriously mixed up than any other, and somehow gloriously come out of it in the end. As I stood there before the old Chancellery, I remembered another visit that I had made to 5 Rue de Chaillot in 1925, and for the convenience of the FBI, who must already have 23 exhibits to fling at me when I am called up before some committee or other, I offer my adventure in 1925 as Exhibit X. Myron Herrick was once more our ambassador to France, and I was granted an interview with him, or, as Counselor Sheldon Whitehouse insisted on calling it, an audience. I had given up diplomacy for journalism, as I used to explain it, and I needed material for an article I was writing about Herrick for an American newspaper. I decided I ought to have a little art to go along with the story, such as a photograph of the ambassador's office, a large, bright, well-appointed room on the second floor facing the street. I knew I couldn't get official permission to take a picture of the room, but this didn't discourage me. I had discovered that the same old French concierge lived in the same rooms on the ground floor of the Chancellery and controlled the opening of the great grilled door. Remembering that Sunday had always been an off day, with a skeleton staff in charge, I picked out a clear Sunday Sabbath for my exploit. I went to the Chancellery and pushed the bell, and the concierge clicked the lock from her room. I went in, said, "Bonjour, madame," went upstairs, photographed the ambassador's office, came down again, having been challenged by nobody, said "Bonjour, madame" to the concierge, raised my hat politely, and went away. The Republicans were in charge of the embassy then, not the Democrats, as in my code clerk days, but things hadn't changed much. I am a pretty good hand at time exposures, and the photograph came out well. There is still a print of it in the art morgue of an American newspaper, or ought to be, but it is merely a view of a room in the home of whatever French family now lives at 5 Rue de Chaillot. We probably learned a lot during the recent war, and I doubt if tourists with cameras could get into any of our embassies today. If this belated confession makes it a bit harder for them anyway, I shall be very happy indeed. I must close now, since somebody is knocking at the door. Why, it's a couple of strange men. Now, what in the world could they want with me? A final note on Chanda Bell. After reading 2 or 3 literary memorials to this or that lamented talent, written by one critic or another. There were only 3 of us around Chanda Bell at the end: Charles Vane, her attorney, Hadley the butler, if he was a butler, and myself. The others had departed with the beginning of the war to new dedications or old hideouts, and the obituaries in the journals after Miss Bell's death were erroneous in claiming that the great dark house in the East 60s was, up to the very last, bedlam and carnival. Chanda Bell's famous largesse and laissez-faire had naturally enough attracted the strange and the sublimated from the nooks and crannies of Greenwich Village. I had been particularly pleased to witness the going away of the middle-aged man who rode the tricycle, the schoolteacher who had resigned from the human race to become a bird, and Miss Menta, the disturbingly nude Chilean transcendentalist. Charles Vane, as regular and as futile as a clock in an empty house, showed up once a week with important documents that Chanda Bell would never sign. Some of them were dated as far back as 1924. A year of my friendship with the gifted lady had passed, so long ago, before I could be sure that I knew what she was trying not to say. But Vane never knew. Her use of the triple negative in such expressions as not unmeaningless, and her habit of starting sentences in the middle bewildered him, and so did her fondness for surrogate words with ambiguous meanings, like the words in dreams: rupture for rapture, centaur for sender, pressure for pleasure, and Scorpio for scrofula. She enjoyed frustrating him, and she made the most of his discomfiture. "Praise me," she would say as he handed her a fountain pen and the documents, which she always waved away. "Praise me," she would command again. He invariably reacted the same way. It had become a kind of ritual. "I repeat that I have not read a novel all the way through since The Crimson Sweater by Ralph Henry Barbour," he would say. His expostulations and his entreaties amused her for a while, but then she would poke at him with her cane and drive him off, crying, "He comes without armor who comes without art." Hadley, who ushered the attorney in and out every Wednesday afternoon, had one cold, impassive eye, and one that he would cause to twinkle. It gave you the chill sense of being, at one and the same time, in the presence of advocate and adversary. His duties in the final months were sparse, consisting mainly of serving Madeira to Chanda Bell and me, or to Chanda Bell and Vane and me in the gray room, after 4 o'clock, when she had had her egg, and had dressed and was ready to receive. One always stood in her presence, for it was Chanda Bell's conceit to believe that only the uncomfortable are capable of pure attention. Chanda Bell was 57 when I first bent over her hand, and her mind seemed so keen and agile it was difficult to believe that she could confuse her guests, even her intimates, with one another. But she did. Charles Vane was sometimes Lord Rudgate, an Englishman of dim background and cryptic reference, and sometimes Strephon, a young mad I cussed in the sprig,